The wind howls like a starving wolf across the high chaparral, whipping dust and the first stinging pellets of sleet against Dr. Elias Thorne's face. He squints, his horse stumbling beneath him, the trail long since vanished. He's lost, feverish from a festering wound on his arm where a cougar raked him 2 days prior, and now this sudden squall threatens to finish what the cat started. Through the grey curtain of the storm, a faint glimmer of light, impossibly distant, then closer. A hut, nestled into a rock overhang, smoke a fragile plume against the violent sky. Hope, or perhaps delirium, pulls him forward. He slides more than dismounts from his exhausted gelding and stumbles towards the rough-hewn door. It creaks open before he can knock, revealing a woman silhouetted against the meager firelight within. Her eyes, wide and dark, fix on him. She holds a bundle of herbs, her lips moving silently. For a moment, with the wind's shriek and his own light-headedness, she looks every bit the witches he'd read about in outdated texts, the kind superstitious folk whispered, existed in these wild places. He's a man of science, of demonstrable facts, but the sight of her, wild-haired and uttering soft incantations over her strange flora, sends a shiver down his spine that has nothing to do with the cold. His arm throbs, a burning fire that eclipses the storm's chill. He needs shelter, help, even if it comes from the devil's own disciple. She simply watches him, her expression unreadable, as he sways on his feet. "Please," he rasps, the word torn away by the wind. "Help me." She doesn't answer, but her gaze drops to the bloodied, crudely bandaged arm, then back to his face, assessing. He's at her mercy, a disquieting thought for a man accustomed to being in control. The light from her small window flickers, casting dancing shadows that make the herbs in her hand seem to writhe. He can smell wood smoke, and something else, something pungent and earthy, and utterly unfamiliar. She's clearly hiding something, this woman of the wilderness, exiled perhaps for reasons he can only guess at. There's more to this woman than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. Her silence stretches, measured only by the storm's fury and the pounding in his head. Then, with a sigh that seems to carry the weariness of ages, she steps back, a silent invitation into the dim warmth. "The storm will kill you, if the fever does not," she says, her voice low and surprisingly steady. And with that, Dr. Elias Thorne, man of logic and scalpel, surrendered himself to the care of the woman they called a witch. His past, the one he carried like a well-worn satchel, was built on the bedrock of empirical evidence. Elias Thorne had been trained in the East, in halls where medicine was a matter of observable symptoms, precise dosages, and the cold, hard facts of anatomy. He'd seen death, of course, too much of it, but he'd always believed it could be understood, if not always defeated, by rigorous science. A personal tragedy, the loss of his young wife to an infection that no known remedy of his could touch, had only hardened his resolve to trust nothing he couldn't see, measure, or dissect. Folk remedies, poultices made of unknown weeds, prayers over the sick, these were the refuge of the ignorant, the domain of charlatans. He had come west seeking not gold, but a place where he could practice medicine unhindered by the stifling orthodoxies of established city hospitals, a place where need was raw and immediate. He hadn't expected to find himself testing the very limits of his beliefs in a hermit's desolate hut. Her name, he learned later, was Ilara. She didn't offer it. He overheard her murmuring it to a scrawny raven that perched on her windowsill during a lull in the storm, as if the bird were her only confidant. The settlement of Redemption, a good day's ride to the southeast, if one knew the way and wasn't bleeding out, had cast her out nearly 2 years prior. The details were murky in his fevered state, gleaned from her reluctant, clipped responses to his delirious questions. Accusations, spurred by a preacher whose child had taken ill and failed to respond to his prayers, then worsened under the care of a traveling tonic salesman. Fear, sharp and contagious as any plague, had spread through Redemption. They'd seen her gathering herbs by moonlight, heard her singing to the plants, witnessed her quiet, solitary ways, and twisted it all into something sinister. Witchcraft. They'd hissed, the word a stone heavy enough to crush a life. They hadn't burned her. Civilization, even on the frontier, had progressed beyond that, but they'd driven her out with curses and threats, leaving her to survive or perish in the unforgiving wilderness. The hut was small, meticulously clean, every object having its place. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, their scents mingling, lavender, sage, chamomile, and others whose names Elias didn't know, their properties a mystery to his educated mind. A rough-hewn table, a single stool, a pallet of furs in one corner that she now insisted he occupy. The landscape outside was a canvas of stark beauty and brutal indifference. Jagged peaks clawed at the sky, and the wind, even after the storm passed, rarely ceased its mournful song through the pines and across the rock-strewn slopes. It was a place that could break a person, or forge them into something as resilient as the ancient junipers that clung to the cliffs. Ilara, it seemed, had been forged. The antagonists in her story weren't mythical demons, but ordinary people steeped in fear and ignorance. He could almost picture them, the stern-faced preacher, his Bible a weapon, the mayor, eager to maintain order and appease the loudest voices, the whispering women and grim-faced men, their faces alight with a righteous, fearful fervor. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pricked Ilara one evening as she changed the poultice on his arm. She saw again the face of Martha Greer, the blacksmith's wife, whose babe Ilara had helped deliver when no one else could, only for Martha to be among the first to point a trembling finger and cry, "Witch." The memory brought a familiar tightening in Ilara's chest, a cold knot of betrayal that even the solitude of the mountains hadn't entirely unraveled. Elias, watching her through half-closed lids, saw the shadow pass over her face. His own arm was a dull, persistent ache now, the aggressive infection held at bay, perhaps even receding, thanks to the strange dark green paste she applied. He tried to analyze it, to identify its components by scent and texture, but it remained stubbornly alien to his pharmacopoeia. He was a doctor, sworn to heal, yet he was being healed by methods he would have dismissed out of hand only days ago. The initial awkwardness between them was thick as the mountain air. Her movements were economical, her words few. She offered him broth, water, changed his dressings with a detached efficiency that was nonetheless gentle. He, in turn, tried to maintain a professional demeanor, even as he lay helpless on her furs, his skepticism warring with a grudging admission that whatever she was doing, it seemed to be working. The stakes were clear. His survival depended on her, and her precarious peace depended on his discretion, assuming he ever left this place. The turning point in his fever, and perhaps in his perception, came on the third night. He'd been restless, thrashing in the grip of a terrifying hallucination where the cougar's claws became the grasping hands of the dead, pulling him down. He cried out, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. Ilara was there instantly, her cool hand on his forehead. She didn't speak, but began to hum, a low, ancient-sounding melody that vibrated through the small cabin. It wasn't a lullaby, not exactly, but something in its cadence, its resonance, seemed to cut through the fever's delirium. He felt the frantic terror recede, like a tide going out. She held a cup to his lips, a bitter tea whose steam carried a strange, calming scent. He drank, coughed, and then, for the first time in days, felt a loosening in his chest, a clarity in his mind. When he woke hours later, the sun was a pale disk in the sky, and the fever had broken. The throbbing in his arm was significantly less, the angry redness around the wound diminished. "What was in that tea?" he asked, his voice still weak but clear. Ilara was tending the fire, her back to him. "Willow bark," she said after a moment, "and valerian root, for the fever and the pain, and to help you rest." Willow bark, salicin, he knew that. A precursor to aspirin. His scientific mind latched onto the familiar. And the humming. She turned then, a small, almost shy smile touching her lips. "My grandmother taught me. She said some hurts are deeper than the flesh, and need a different kind of mending." His grandmother, not a grimoire, not a pact with unseen forces. He felt a flush of something like shame for his earlier, uncharitable thoughts. Her methods were unconventional, rooted in traditions his world had dismissed, but they were not without their own logic, their own efficacy. This was the catalyst. He saw her not as an exile dabbling in the dark arts, but as a woman possessing a deep, perhaps intuitive, understanding of the natural world, a knowledge passed down, refined by experience. It was healing, stripped of pretense, raw and elemental as the mountains themselves. He decided then, as he lay there, weak but lucid, that he wouldn't just accept her help, he would try to understand it. It was a physician's duty, after all, to explore all avenues of healing. He tried to pay her, offering the few coins he had, but she waved them away. "Rest is the only payment I require now," she said. "And perhaps when you leave, you will not speak of me to those in redemption." Her request was simple, her fear palpable. He nodded, a silent promise. The first test of their strange, forced coexistence came a day later. He was strong enough to sit up, to observe her more closely as she prepared her remedies. She was grinding dried leaves in a stone mortar, her movements practiced and efficient. "What are those?" he asked, curiosity overriding his usual reserve. "Comfrey," she replied without looking up. "For the skin, to help it knit." He knew of comfrey, though it was often dismissed by his peers as an old wives' tale. Yet his own wound was healing with remarkable speed, the flesh clean and pink. "My colleagues in the East would call this unscientific." Ilara paused, her gaze meeting his. There was no defensiveness in her eyes, only a quiet certainty. Perhaps their science has not yet caught up with what the Earth already knows. It was a simple statement, yet it resonated deeply within him. He was a man of books and laboratories, she a woman of earth and intuition. For the first time, he considered that these two worlds might not be entirely opposed. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm established itself in the small cabin. Elias, still regaining his strength, became an observer. He watched Ilara as she moved through her small domain, her connection to the wild plants and creatures almost symbiotic. She knew which roots to dig after a rain, which leaves to gather at dawn, which barks held power when scraped from the sunny side of the tree. She talked to them, not in the way of madness, but with a respect that bordered on reverence. He saw her mend a bird's broken wing with a deftness that rivaled any surgeon's, splinting it with tiny twigs and a bandage of soft moss. She knew the calls of the animals, the subtle shifts in weather, the language of the wind. He began to ask questions, cautious at first, then with growing interest. "That tea you gave me for the fever, willow bark, you said. How did you know its properties?" "My grandmother taught me," she would often say, and her mother before her. Some knowledge is passed in the blood and in the stories told by the fire. He learned that her magic was, in fact, a profound and intricate system of herbalism honed over generations. She knew the plants that could soothe a cough, staunch bleeding, draw out infection, or ease a troubled mind. She understood dosages, combinations, the right times for harvesting. He began to make notes in his physician's journal, sketching the plants she used, recording her methods, initially with a clinical detachment that slowly gave way to a grudging, then genuine, respect. He even recognized some plants mentioned in ancient medical texts he'd once dismissed as folklore, now seeing their practical application. Yarrow to stop bleeding, plantain as a poultice. These were not spells, but nature's pharmacy, and Ilara was its skilled apothecary. There were moments of shared quiet, too, evenings when the fire crackled, and the only sounds were the wind outside and the rustle of Ilara grinding herbs or stitching a patch onto her worn dress. He would read from one of the few books he carried in his saddlebags, often medical texts, but sometimes poetry, and she would listen, her hands never idle, her dark eyes occasionally flicking up to meet his. In those moments, the labels of doctor and witch seemed to fade, leaving only two people sharing a fragile sanctuary. Yet, the outside world, and Elias's ingrained skepticism, were never far away. One afternoon, a lone rider, a trapper by his look, passed close enough to the cabin for his dogs to catch Ilara's scent. They barked furiously, straining at their leashes, their master peering suspiciously towards the hidden dwelling. Ilara froze, her face paling, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she wore at her belt. The trapper, after a moment, grunted and pulled his dogs away, disappearing back into the trees. The incident, though brief, was a stark reminder of her precarious existence, of the fear that was her constant shadow. Elias saw it, and a protective instinct, unfamiliar and surprising, stirred within him. Later, he found himself saying, "You are safe here. I won't let anyone harm you." The words were out before he'd fully considered them, a spontaneous declaration that seemed to surprise them both. Elara merely nodded, but he thought he saw a flicker of gratitude, perhaps even trust, in her eyes before she looked away. His own internal conflict remained. There were times when her explanations, or lack thereof, for why a certain remedy worked, frustrated his scientific mind. "It is simply the way of this plant," she might say, or "the mountain spirits taught my ancestors." He would bite back a retort about empirical data and repeatable experiments. But then he would look at his arm, healing cleanly and quickly, or witness her calming a colicky infant from a nomadic Ute family who'd sought her out, their own shaman miles away, and his certainty would waver. He saw her diagnose the child's distress with an astute eye, her hands gentle as she massaged its tiny belly with a warmed oil infused with chamomile and dill, herbs he knew had carminative properties. The child's cries subsided, and the worried parents looked at Elara with awe. These were successes, undeniable. His morale, however, sometimes dipped. He was a physician, trained to heal through knowledge he could articulate, defend, and teach. What Elara did, while effective, felt intuitive, almost mystical at times. Was he abandoning his principles by even countenancing it? He missed his books, his instruments, the familiar rituals of his own practice. One evening, he voiced some of this frustration. "I need to understand how it works, Elara, not just that it does." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "Does the hawk understand the wind, or does it simply know how to fly upon it? Some things are learned by doing, by listening, not only by dissecting." Her words, though gentle, were a challenge. He was beginning to realize that his world of medicine, for all its advancements, might have lost something vital, a connection to the earth, an acceptance of mystery. The growing respect he felt for her was undeniable, as was a burgeoning awareness that went beyond mere professional curiosity. He found himself noticing the way the firelight caught the auburn glints in her dark hair, the quiet strength in her hands, the resilience in her often somber eyes. She, in turn, seemed less wary of him, occasionally sharing a small smile or a story about a plant or animal, her voice losing some of its customary reserve. The time was approaching when Elias would be strong enough to leave. The thought brought a complex mix of emotions. He needed to return to his own life, his own work. But the idea of leaving Elara to her isolation, to the constant threat of discovery, filled him with an unease he couldn't quite name. And what would he say if asked about his miraculous recovery? Could he, in good conscience, dismiss what he had witnessed here? He was no longer just a patient. He was a witness, perhaps even a student, though neither of them would have used that word. The unspoken question hung between them. What came next? His departure would be a test, not just of his physical strength, but of the convictions he now held, convictions that had been profoundly, irrevocably altered in this small, storm-battered cabin high in the mountains. The turning point arrived not with a dramatic pronouncement, but with a desperate plea carried on the wind. A young man, barely more than a boy, his face streaked with dust and tears, stumbled upon Elara's hidden path. He was from Redemption, son of the carpenter, and his younger sister, little Sarah, was dying. A fever, the coughing sickness, had swept through the settlement, and Sarah was the worst afflicted. The town's part-time doctor, a man more skilled at dentistry and horse liniment, had declared her beyond his help. Their preacher, the very one who had spearheaded Elara's exile, had prayed over the child for days, but she only worsened. In their despair, remembering whispers of the witch in the mountains who supposedly had healing powers, the boy's mother had sent him as a last, desperate resort. "Please," the boy choked out, falling to his knees before Elara, who had come to the door at the sound of his frantic approach. "They say you have ways. Sarah, she's burning up. She can't breathe." Elias, now almost fully recovered, stood beside Elara. He saw the conflict in her face, the fear of returning to the place that had condemned her, pitted against the innate healer's instinct to help. He saw, too, the terror in the boy's eyes, a reflection of the desperation that must be gripping Redemption. "What are her symptoms?" Elias asked, his voice calm, professional. The boy described them: a raging fever, a deep, racking cough that produced blood, streaked phlegm, a bluish tinge to her lips and fingernails. Pneumonia, Elias diagnosed silently, and a severe case. Time was critical. Ilara looked at Elias, her eyes searching his. "They will not welcome me," she said softly. "They will call me devil, sent, especially if—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. If the child died under her care, her fate would be sealed. "I will go with you," Elias stated, his decision instantaneous and absolute. "I am a doctor. I will speak for you." "Her methods," he said, meeting Ilara's gaze, "are sound. I have witnessed them." This was the game changer. His training, his reputation, everything he had built his professional life upon, he was now willing to risk for this woman, for the truth he had discovered in her isolated hut. He would not stand by and let ignorance, or fear, claim another life, nor allow Ilara to face that judgment alone. The fear in her eyes lessened, replaced by a dawning, hesitant hope. The high-pressure countdown had begun. Sarah was fading. Redemption was a good half-day's ride, faster if they pushed the horses. Ilara quickly gathered a satchel of herbs, mullein for the lungs, elderflower to reduce fever, a potent tincture of echinacea and usnea lichen. He'd seen her prepare for deep infections. As they prepared to leave, Ilara paused. "Why are you doing this, Elias? For me?" He looked at her, the woman who had saved his life, the woman who had shown him a different kind of knowledge. "I'm doing this because it's right, Ilara, and yes, for you. But also for myself. I came west to practice medicine, to heal. I won't let prejudice dictate where or how that happens." The tactical plan was simple, audacious even. They would ride into redemption, not as a supplicant witch and her captive, but as two healers, offering their combined knowledge. Elias would be her shield, her scientific validator. Ilara would be the one with the remedies that might actually work where others had failed. They would face the town together. It was a ramp-up to a showdown, not just with a disease, but with the deep-seated fear and dogma that had cast Ilara out. The fate of a child, and perhaps the future of Ilara's acceptance, hung in the balance. The ride to redemption was swift and silent, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the outskirts, the settlement looked small and vulnerable under the vast sky, a collection of rough-hewn buildings huddled against the encroaching wilderness. News of their arrival, or rather Ilara's, preceded them like a brushfire. Faces appeared in windows, doors creaked open, revealing wary, fearful eyes. Whispers followed them like autumn leaves skittering in their wake. "The witch! She's come back. What does Thorn want with her?" They rode directly to the carpenter's small house, where a crowd had already begun to gather. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a mixture of desperate hope and ingrained suspicion. The carpenter, a burly man named Thomas, his face etched with grief and sleeplessness, met them at the door. His wife, Mary, stood behind him, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a worn rag doll. "Is it true?" Mary whispered, her gaze fixed on Ilara. "Can you help our Sarah?" Before Ilara could speak, Preacher Davies pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of grim disapproval. "What is the meaning of this, Thorn? Bringing this woman here? Have you forgotten she was cast out for consorting with darkness?" Elias dismounted, his stance firm as he faced the preacher. "I have forgotten nothing, preacher. I have also not forgotten my oath as a physician to preserve life. Ilara possesses knowledge of healing that may save this child. I have seen its efficacy with my own eyes. My own life was saved by her skills." A murmur ran through the crowd. Dr. Thorn was a respected man, educated, scientific. His endorsement carried weight. "Skills," Davies scoffed, "or sorcery. We will not have witchcraft in redemption, not while I draw breath." "It is not witchcraft, preacher," Elias countered, his voice rising to carry over the crowd's nervous muttering. "It is knowledge of the earth, of plants given to us for healing, a knowledge your fear has blinded you to. Are you so convinced of your own righteousness that you would deny this child her only chance?" The challenge hung in the air. Davies flushed, but before he could retort, a small, weak cough echoed from within the house, followed by a mother's soft cry. The sound cut through the tension, a stark reminder of the life hanging in the balance. Mary, the mother, pushed past her husband and the preacher, her eyes pleading with Ilara. "Please, try. We have nothing left to lose." Ilara looked at the mother, then at the hostile faces in the crowd, and finally at Elias, who gave her a barely perceptible nod of encouragement. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, But the sight of the mother's despair, the sound of that child's struggle, overrode it. This was why she healed, why she had always healed, despite the risks. She stepped forward. "I will try." Inside the small, dim room, Sarah lay on a narrow cot, her small face flushed crimson, her breathing shallow and rapid. The air was heavy with the scent of sickness. Ilara knelt beside the child, her touch gentle as she felt her forehead, listened to her chest. Elias stood near, observing, a silent pillar of support. Ilara worked quickly, preparing a steam inhalation with eucalyptus and thyme to open the child's airways, her movements precise and confident. She brewed a tea of mullein, licorice root, and elderflower, coaxing the child to sip the warm liquid. She spoke softly to Sarah, her voice a low, soothing murmur, not unlike the humming Elias remembered from his own fevered nights. Hours passed. Ilara didn't waver, applying cool compresses, changing the child's sweat-soaked linens, offering sips of tea and broth. Elias, meanwhile, fielded questions from the anxious parents, explaining in simple terms what Ilara was doing, relating the properties of the herbs to what he knew of medicine. He spoke of febrifuges, expectorants, demulcents, words that, while perhaps not fully understood, lent an air of legitimacy to Ilara's actions. Outside, the crowd remained, their initial hostility slowly giving way to a tense, hopeful vigil. Preacher Davies still hovered, his disapproval a palpable force, but even he was subdued by the gravity of the situation and by Elias Thorne's unwavering presence beside the witch. The struggle was twofold. Ilara battled the disease ravaging Sarah's small body, while Elias battled the prejudice that threatened to condemn them both. He saw the fear in Ilara's eyes when she looked up and met the gaze of a particularly hostile townsman peering through the window, but she never faltered in her care for the child. He saw his own colleagues from the east in his mind's eye, scoffing at these rustic methods, and for a moment, doubt flickered. But then he looked at Ilara's calm, focused face, at the small, almost imperceptible signs that Sarah might be responding, a slight easing of her breathing, a less frantic pulse, and his conviction returned, stronger than ever. The triumph, when it came, was quiet, almost imperceptible at first. Towards dawn, Sarah's fever began to recede. Her breathing, though still raspy, deepened. A faint touch of pink returned to her lips. Ilara, exhausted but alert, laid a hand on the child's forehead. "The worst has passed," she whispered. Mary, who had kept vigil all night, let out a sob of pure relief, clutching Ilara's hand. "Thank you," she wept. "Oh God, thank you." When Elias and Ilara finally emerged from the house, blinking in the early morning light, the crowd was still there. Thomas, Sarah's father, stepped forward, his face working with emotion. "She's better," he announced, his voice thick. "The fever's broken. Our Sarah, she's going to live." A collective sigh went through the crowd. Preacher Davies stood apart, his face unreadable, but the fight seemed to have gone out of him. The undeniable truth of a child saved, a life reclaimed from the brink, was a more powerful sermon than any he could deliver. Elias had risked his reputation, aligning himself with an outcast. Ilara had risked her safety, returning to the community that had spurned her, and in their shared courage, they had not only saved a child, but had also chipped away at the wall of fear and ignorance. Their bond, forged in isolation and tested in crisis, was now solidified. They had chosen to stand together, and in doing so, had shown redemption a different kind of power, the power of healing, compassion, and an open mind. The witch had performed her magic, and the skeptical doctor had been its most crucial witness and advocate. In the quiet aftermath, as the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over redemption, a sense of fragile peace settled. Ilara and Elias sat on a rough bench outside the carpenter's house, sipping cool water. The exhaustion was profound, yet beneath it lay a deep, resonant satisfaction. Mary brought them fresh bread and cheese, her eyes still shining with unshed tears of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, looking from Ilara to Elias. "You saved her." Ilara offered a small, tired smile. "Sarah is a strong child. She fought hard." Several townsfolk approached, hesitant at first, then with more confidence. Old Man Hemlock, who had been one of the loudest voices condemning Ilara 2 years prior, shuffled forward, hat in hand. "Ma'am," he mumbled, not quite meeting her eye. That was a good thing you did. A Christian thing. It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was an acknowledgement, a subtle shift in perception. Preacher Davies watched from a distance, then turned and walked slowly towards his church, his shoulders slumped. Perhaps even he was beginning to question the certainty of his own judgments. Ilara felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She was no longer just the exiled witch, a spectre of fear. In the eyes of these people, even if only for this moment, she was a healer. She had found her voice not in anger or defiance, but in the quiet demonstration of her skill, her compassion. When Thomas offered her payment, she gently refused. "Knowing Sarah will be well is payment enough," she said. But she did accept a basket of fresh eggs and a newly knitted shawl from Mary, tokens of genuine gratitude. As they prepared to leave Redemption, to return to the quiet solitude of Ilara's mountain cabin, Elias spoke. "You don't have to go back to being alone, Ilara. There are people here now who see your worth." Ilara looked at the small settlement, then towards the vast, embracing mountains. "Perhaps," she said softly, "but the mountains are my home now. They taught me much." "Still," she added, a rare, warm smile gracing her lips as she met his gaze, "it would be good to know I am not entirely forgotten by the world below." Their return journey was different. A new sense of ease flowed between them. The cabin, when they reached it, felt less like a refuge born of exile and more like a sanctuary, a place of peace and shared understanding. He watched her move about the familiar space, her hands, sure and gentle, tending to her herbs, stoking the fire. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the interior with hues of amber and rose. He realized that her magic was not supernatural, but profoundly natural, a deep, intuitive connection to the healing energies of the earth, a knowledge honed by generations, a skill wielded with wisdom and compassion. It was something to be respected, cherished, even learned from. He reached out, his hand covering hers as she ground dried lavender. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, questioning but unafraid. "Your magic, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "is the truest medicine I have ever witnessed." Her fingers stilled beneath his, a soft blush rose on her cheeks. In that shared gaze, in the gentle pressure of his hand, was an acknowledgement that transcended words, a recognition of her true worth, a testament to the bond they had forged, a promise of a new beginning built not on fear or skepticism, but on mutual respect and a dawning, quiet affection. He had come to her cabin a wounded skeptic. He would stay, he knew now, as a believer, not in witchcraft, but in the profound healing power of the human spirit and the earth itself. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.